Ilara watched her husband stride through the gilded doors of the drawing room and felt her hope wither into dust. He did not look at her. He did not pause. He walked past her outstretched hand as though she were nothing but a shadow clinging to the wall. Around them, the low murmur of guests faltered, then sharpened into whispers. She let her hand fall slowly, her fingers curling against the silk of her gown. The smile she had practiced for hours stayed pinned to her lips, but it felt like a mask made of ice. 4 months. 4 months since she had become the Duchess of Thornwood, and still Alexander had not spoken a single warm word to her. The dinner had been her idea. She had spent days planning the menu, choosing the flowers, hoping that a quiet evening with a few of his political allies might allow her to stand beside him as his equal. Instead, he had seated her at the far end of the table, so distant she could barely hear his voice. When she had tried to catch his eye, his gaze had slipped past her as though she were part of the furniture. Now, after the meal, he had walked directly to Lord Ashworth and begun a conversation without even acknowledging her presence. She could feel the eyes of the other ladies upon her, their fans fluttering like curious moths. Lady Cecily leaned towards Mrs. Pemberton, her whisper audible enough to sting. "They say he only married her because her father begged. Such a pity when a man is trapped." Ilara's throat tightened, but she did not flinch. She had learned in the long, silent months since her wedding to fold her pain into a neat, invisible square and tuck it beneath her ribs. She simply stood, smiled at no one in particular, and excused herself towards the terrace. No one tried to stop her. The night air was cool and smelled of damp earth. Beyond the balustrade, the formal gardens of Thornwood Hall stretched into darkness. She gripped the stone edge and let out a breath that trembled. She had not cried since the morning her father had told her, with hollow eyes, that Lord Percival Harrow would not be coming to the church, that she had been discarded, that their family's debts would swallow them whole. And then, within a week, the Duke of Thornwood had appeared like a silent storm, offering his name and his fortune with a coldness that had terrified and relieved her in equal measure. She had dared to hope. That was her mistake. Alexander was not cruel in the way of shouting men. He was simply absent. He did not scold her. He did not touch her at all. On their wedding night he had bowed politely and retired to his own chambers, leaving her alone in a vast bed that smelled of lavender and loneliness. Since then, they had lived as two strangers sharing a roof, their conversations measured in clipped words over breakfast. A footstep sounded behind her. She turned, heart leaping, but it was only a maid collecting empty glasses. Ilara forced another smile and looked back at the stars. The mask held. It always did. The next morning she tried again. She dressed carefully in a soft dove-gray morning gown and descended to the breakfast room before him, arranging the papers beside his plate and pouring his tea herself. When Alexander entered, tall and dark-haired, his face unreadable as a marble statue, he paused for the briefest moment at the sight of her. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady. "I thought we might discuss the tenants' requests together. I have looked over the accounts." He pulled out his chair and sat without meeting her eyes. "That is not necessary. My steward manages the estate." "I only wish to help," she said quietly, settling into her own chair across the long table. "As your Duchess, it is my duty to—" "Your duty," he repeated, the word flat and heavy. He unfolded the newspaper with a crisp snap. "There is no need to trouble yourself." The silence that followed was louder than any rebuke. She stared at her plate, her appetite gone. He did not look up again until his coffee was finished. Then he rose, straightened his cuffs, and walked out without another word. The door clicked shut, and Ilara sat alone in the vast, sunlit room, the tea growing cold in her cup. Weeks passed like this, each day a quiet wound. She arranged flowers in the hall and he walked past them without comment. She learned his schedule and waited in the library, only for him to bypass it entirely. She wrote him small notes, inquiring after his day, and found them later, unopened, on his desk. Each silence was a small death. She might have endured it, might have kept hopping, had it not been for the ball at Ashworth Manor. It was a grand affair, the kind of glittering crush that London society adored. Alara had worn a gown of deep emerald silk, the color of moss after rain, and had threaded pearls through her dark hair. She had felt, for the first time in months, almost beautiful. Alexander had escorted her in silence, his arm stiff beneath her fingers, and the moment they entered the ballroom he had released her as though her touch burned. Within minutes, he was dancing with Lady Cecilia Markham. The widow was everything Alara was not, golden-haired, vivacious, with a laugh that rang like bells. She leaned into Alexander's shoulder as they turned, her gloved hand resting intimately on his sleeve. He looked down at her with an expression Alara had never once seen directed at herself, attentive, almost warm. The sight of it lodged in her chest like a splinter. She stood at the edge of the dance floor, a glass of ratafia untouched in her hand. Groups of matrons murmured nearby, their glances sliding over her with pity or amusement. She heard snatches of their words. "Poor thing, he barely looks at her. Everyone knows he only took her out of honor. Still pinning for Lord Harrow, they say." Alara's fingers tightened until the stem of her glass threatened to snap. She was not pinning for Lord Harrow. She had never loved the Viscount. Their engagement had been a cold, contractual arrangement her father had crafted to settle his debts. But the world believed she had been heartbroken, and Alexander clearly believed it too. She saw him lean to whisper something in Lady Cecilia's ear. The widow laughed, her fan fluttering. Alara turned away, the splinter twisting. She walked to the terrace, the same escape she had used so many times before, and stood in the darkness until her hands stopped shaking. That night in the carriage home, the silence was suffocating. Alexander stared out the window, his jaw tight. She looked at his profile, the sharp line of his nose, the mouth that never curved for her, and something inside her quietly snapped. It was not a dramatic breaking. It was more like the final thread of a frayed rope giving way. She stopped hopping. The change was so subtle that even she did not recognize it at first. She simply stopped waiting. She no longer rose early to arrange his tea. She no longer lingered in the corridors hopping to catch his eye. She stopped leaving notes that would never be read. Instead, she began to walk. The grounds of Thornwood Hall were extensive, and on the eastern boundary lay a small village that had seen better days. It was on one of her aimless rides that she first noticed the building, a crumbling stone house with a rusted sign that read St. Anne's Home for Children. Faint, thin cries echoed from within, and a harried-looking woman in a faded cap was trying to soothe a coughing infant on the doorstep. Alara dismounted without thinking. The woman, a Mrs. Bellamy, looked up with startled, exhausted eyes. Within an hour, Alara had learned that the orphanage was funded by a pittance from the parish, and that the children lacked medicine, blankets, and proper food. She returned the next day with a basket of bread and a trunk of old linens. The day after, she brought a physician. Dr. Elliot Ward was a young man with kind brown eyes and hands that were gentle even when they were brisk. He had recently arrived in the county and volunteered his time for the poor. When Alara explained the children's needs, he listened without the faint condescension she had come to expect from gentlemen. He simply nodded and began to work. For the first time in months, Alara felt useful. She organized donations, oversaw repairs, and sat with the children while Dr. Ward examined them. The hollow ache in her chest did not vanish, but it was slowly filled by small, tangible things. A child's sticky fingers clutching hers, a weak cough easing after medicine, a shy smile from a girl who had not spoken in a year. At Thornwood Hall, her absence went unremarked at first. Alexander was busy with Parliament and estate matters, and he barely noticed that his wife no longer haunted the corridors. But gradually, subtle things began to prick at his awareness. The breakfast room felt oddly silent, even though he had never encouraged conversation. The flowers in the hall, which she used to arrange with such care, were now placed by a maid, and the arrangements were lopsided. One evening, he found himself pausing outside the library, expecting to see her seated by the fire with a book. The room was empty. It was a servant who told him where she went. "Her Grace rides to the orphanage most mornings, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her tone carefully neutral. "She often does not return until dusk." Alexander frowned. The orphanage. He vaguely recalled its existence on the far edge of his land, a forgotten charity his mother had once supported. He had not given it a thought in years. He told himself he was merely curious, that a duchess should not spend her days among grime and illness without proper supervision. It was concern, nothing more. One gray afternoon, he rode out to St. Anne. He did not announce himself. He left his horse at the gate and walked through the overgrown garden towards the sound of laughter. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. Alara was sitting on a low stone bench, a small girl on her lap, her dark hair escaping its pins and curling around her face. Her gown was plain cotton, smudged at the hem, and her cheeks were flushed with warmth. She was laughing, truly laughing, the sound light and free as the child tugged at her locket. Beside her stood a man, young and easy in his stance, holding a stethoscope and grinning. The physician, Alexander presumed. The man said something, and Alara tilted her head back, her laughter rising again. Something hot and unfamiliar coiled in Alexander's chest. He had never made her laugh. He had never even tried. He saw the easy familiarity between them, the way the doctor's hand almost brushed her shoulder as he passed, and that coil tightened into something sharp and possessive. He did not approach. He turned and walked back to his horse, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. That evening at dinner, he broke the silence for the first time in weeks. "I understand you have been spending considerable time at the orphanage." Alara looked up from her soup, her expression calm. "Yes, the children needed assistance. There are people employed to manage such charities. It is not seemly for a duchess to labor like a common nurse, and to be so familiar with a physician." His voice was cooler than he intended. Her spoon paused midair. She set it down with deliberate care. "Dr. Ward has been generous with his time. He treats the children without charge. I hardly think a friendly conversation is a breach of decorum. It invites gossip." "Gossip," she repeated softly. "I am already the subject of gossip, Your Grace. It cannot be helped. I might as well do some good while I am at it." The calm finality in her tone unsettled him more than any tears. He opened his mouth to respond, but she had already risen. "If you will excuse me, I am rather tired. Good night." She curtsied, a perfect, distant motion, and left the room. Alexander stared at the empty doorway, a strange, hollow sensation spreading through his ribs. She had not argued. She had not pleaded or looked wounded. She had simply withdrawn, as if his opinion no longer mattered. The thought frightened him in a way he could not name. Over the following weeks he began to watch her. It was an unconscious habit at first. He found himself glancing towards the window when he heard the sound of her horse departing. He noticed the new calmness in her posture, the way she no longer tensed when he entered a room. She was polite, always polite, but the soft, hopeful light that had once flickered in her eyes whenever she looked at him was gone, extinguished. He missed it. He missed it with a ferocity that bewildered him. One afternoon, he returned early from a meeting and saw a carriage he did not recognize in the drive. A visitor's carriage. Curious, he entered through the side door and made his way to the small parlor where Alara received callers. The door was ajar, and he could hear her voice, low and measured. "I thank you for your kind words, my lord, but my answer must remain the same. I am a married woman." A man's voice answered, smooth and insistent. "Alara, please, I made a terrible mistake. I was a fool to let you go. Thornwood does not value you, everyone sees it. Come away with me. I can give you the life you deserve." Alexander's blood turned to ice. He knew that voice. Lord Percival Harrow. The man who had abandoned her, who had left her ruined, now stood in his home, pleading with his wife. He pushed the door open without conscious thought. Alara stood by the fireplace, her back straight as a blade. Harrow was nearer to her than was proper, his handsome face arranged in a mask of regret. Both of them turned at his entrance. Harrow's expression flickered with unease, but Alara remained utterly composed. "Your Grace," she said, as if announcing a guest at a dull tea. "Lord Harrow was just leaving." Harrow opened his mouth, but the look on Alexander's face stopped him cold. The Duke of Thornwood had a reputation for icy control, but now his eyes blazed with a fury that made the air crackle. He did not speak. He simply held the door wider, his gaze never leaving the Viscount. Harrow's bravado crumpled. He gave a stiff bow and retreated with as much dignity as he could muster. The door closed behind him, and the silence in the room became a living thing. Alara was the first to break it. "I did not invite him. He came unannounced." "And what did he offer you?" Alexander's voice was low, dangerous. "A second chance, an escape from this miserable prison of a marriage." She flinched, a tiny crack in her composure. "He offered me nothing that I want." "You expect me to believe that? You were engaged to him. You loved him." "I never loved him." The words burst from her, sharp and raw. "The engagement was my father's doing, a bargain to settle his debts. I felt nothing for Lord Harrow but relief when he fled. Is that what you have thought all this time, that I have been pinning for him?" Alexander stared at her, the ground shifting beneath his feet. You did not love him." "No," her voice was quiet now, weary. "But you did not ask. You never asked me anything. You looked at me on our wedding day as if I were a burden you had been forced to carry, and you have not looked at me since. I have spent months trying to reach you, and you have given me nothing but silence and coldness. Do you know what that has done to me?" He took a step towards her, his heart hammering. "Ilara." She held up a hand, and the gesture stopped him more effectively than any wall. "I cannot do it any longer. I have tried to be a good wife to you. I have tried to earn your respect, but I will not spend my life as a ghost in this house. I want a separation." The word hit him like a physical blow. Separation. She wanted to leave. The thought of Thornwood Hall without her, of his days stretching into an endless, empty quiet, sent a surge of panic through his chest so violent he could barely breathe. "No," the denial was hoarse, almost a plea. "Ilara, please, you cannot leave. I will not allow it. You have no right to keep me here, when you have made it clear I am nothing to you." "That is not true." His voice cracked, the icy composure he had worn for years shattering like glass. "It has never been true. I have loved you from the moment I first saw you, 2 years ago at a musicale in London. You were standing by the window in a blue gown, and you looked so terribly sad, and I thought I would do anything to see you smile. But you were promised to Harrow. When he abandoned you, I saw my chance, not out of duty or pity, but because I could not bear the thought of you suffering. I married you knowing you might never love me, and I told myself that was enough. But I was a coward. I was so afraid of seeing indifference in your eyes that I built a fortress of silence around myself, and in doing so, I have hurt you more than any enemy ever could." He was trembling. The Duke of Thornwood, the coldest man in the county, was trembling. Ilara stared at him, her hand pressed to her lips, her eyes shimmering. "You loved me," she whispered, "all this time." "Desperately, hopelessly. I wrote you letters every week, letters I never sent because I was too afraid of your reply. I watched you from my study window and memorized the way you turned the pages of your book. I wanted to cross the distance between us 1,000 times, but I told myself you were still mourning a man who did not deserve you. I have been a fool, the greatest fool who ever lived." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, worn box. He held it out to her with shaking hands. "These are for you. They have always been for you." She took the box and opened it. Inside lay a stack of folded papers, each covered in his neat, slanted handwriting. She unfolded the first, and her tears finally spilled over. The words were achingly tender, confessions of love and longing, apologies for his silence, hopes that she might one day look at him with something other than fear or sorrow. There were dozens of them, dated across the long, lonely months of their marriage. A sob escaped her, raw and broken. She looked up at him through a blur of tears. "I thought you were ashamed of me. I thought you had married me only because my father begged. I never dared to hope that you might." He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, but he did not touch her. He stopped just before her, his hands hanging at his sides, his face a mask of desperate hope. "Alara, I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. I have been cruel in my silence, and I have wasted months that we can never reclaim. But if there is any part of you that could ever, if you could ever learn to—" She did not let him finish. She stepped forward and laid her palm against his cheek, and the touch shattered the last of his composure. His hands came up to cradle her face as though she were made of spun glass, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I have loved you too," she whispered. "I think I began to love you the day you walked into my father's house and offered me your name with such solemn eyes. I tried so hard to reach you, and when you pushed me away, I thought I had imagined any kindness in you. But I loved you. I never stopped." A sound escaped him, something between a laugh and a sob. He pulled her into his arms and held her with a fierce, desperate tenderness, his face buried in her hair. She felt the shudder of his breath, the rapid beat of his heart against her own. They stood like that for a long, trembling moment, two people who had been starving in the midst of plenty, finally allowed to feast. When he drew back, his eyes were red-rimmed but clearer than she had ever seen them. "I will spend the rest of my life making up for every day I wasted. I will tell you every morning that I love you. I will walk beside you, not past you. I will be the husband you deserved from the start, if you will let me." She gave a watery smile, her fingers tangling with his. "I would like that, but you must promise me one thing." "Anything." "You must come to the orphanage. The children need a roof that does not leak, and I have already promised them a proper schoolroom. I will need the Duke's support." He let out a breathless laugh, the first true laugh she had ever heard from him. "You shall have it. You shall have anything, the whole estate if you wish. I will tear down the roof myself and build a new one." "That will not be necessary. Merely your presence will suffice." He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his lips lingering as though he could not bear to stop touching her. "You have it, now and always." The healing did not happen in a single night. There were still shadows to dispel, old wounds to mend. But they talked now, truly talked, long into the small hours, unraveling months of misunderstandings and buried pain. She told him about the mornings she had waited for a glance that never came, the evenings she had cried herself to sleep in that vast, lonely bed. He told her about the terror that had gripped him every time he thought of losing her to Harrow, the jealousy that had curdled into coldness, because he had not known how else to protect himself. They wept together, and then they laughed, and then they simply sat in the quiet library, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her. When the dawn came, pale and golden through the windows, Alexander looked down at the woman in his arms and felt a gratitude so profound it ached. She had given him a gift he did not deserve, a second chance. 1 month later, the county gathered for the autumn ball at Thornwood Hall. It was the first grand event the Duchess had hosted since her wedding, and speculation buzzed through the ton like static. They expected to see the same distant, frigid couple, the Duke's attention elsewhere, the Duchess fatting into the wallpaper. What they saw instead left them speechless. The Duke of Thornwood did not leave his wife's side the entire evening. He held her hand as they greeted their guests, his thumb tracing small circles on her glove. He led her into the first dance, and the way he looked at her, with a warmth so unguarded it was almost painful to witness, silenced every whisper in the room. When the music ended, he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it in full view of everyone, his eyes never leaving hers. Alara glowed. She wore a gown of deep rose silk, the color of new beginnings, and her laughter rippled through the ballroom like music. She was no longer the pale, invisible woman haunting the corners. She was the heart of the evening, vibrant and sure. And whenever her husband's gaze found her across the crowded room, the silent message between them was unmistakable. Later that night, When the last carriage had rolled away and the chandeliers had dimmed, they stood together on the terrace where she had once hidden her tears. The autumn air was crisp, scented with wood smoke and the last of the garden's roses. He draped his coat over her shoulders and pulled her close. "I watched you tonight," he murmured against her hair. "You were magnificent. Everyone was captivated." She tilted her head to look up at him, a teasing light in her eyes. "Even Lady Cecilia." He winced, a sheepish smile tugging at his mouth. "I have already written to Lady Cecilia, informing her that my dancing days are reserved exclusively for my wife." "A wise decision, Your Grace." "I am becoming wise at last." He cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "You have taught me everything: how to hope, how to love without fear, how to be the man I should have been from the start." She rose on her toes and pressed a soft, sweet kiss to his lips, a kiss that tasted of forgiveness and future. "We taught each other," she whispered, "and we shall keep teaching each other every day." The stars wheeled overhead, and the great house behind them settled into peaceful silence. Some loves are found in grand, sweeping moments, but theirs was found in the quiet courage to stay when staying seemed impossible, and to speak when silence had nearly destroyed them both. It was a love that had been lost and found again, not through magic, but through the slow, brave work of two hearts refusing to give up. In the months that followed, the orphanage received its new roof, and the children grew strong and rosy. Dr. Ward remained a beloved friend, and he often dined at Thornwood Hall, where the Duke was careful to sit on his wife's other side, his hand resting casually on the back of her chair. There were no more cold breakfasts, no more unread letters. There were morning walks through the frosted gardens, conversations that stretched late into the night, and a nursery that, one crisp spring morning, was prepared for a new arrival. And every night, before the candles were extinguished, Alexander would take Alara's face in his hands and say the words he had once been too afraid to speak. "I love you, I have always loved you, I will always love you." She would smile, her eyes bright with all the hope she had once thought lost, and answer, "And I you," until the very end.